Get on to the exciting Bredhurst Garden Centre.
Thank you, Chair. Considering the hour, I will try and be as brief as possible. This is an application for the erection of 4 houses on the Bredhurst Garden Centre. It involves the demolition of existing wedding venue, office and other commercial buildings, and the erection, as I say, of 4 detached dwellings with associated parking and infrastructure and landscaping. You will notice from the main body of the report the main issues, and I draw members' attention to the fact the site is in open countryside within the AONB, Special Landscape Area and Strategic Gap. The principle of development within Section 8 of the report goes into some detail about the impact, as the officer perceives it, of the proposal upon the AONB and visual impact, and concludes that there is some harm, some visual harm, which is inevitable within any built development in the countryside, but this needs to be weighed against the benefits of the housing and the relationship with the existing brownfield use. The report goes on to cover amenity issues, highways, landscaping, and concludes that on balance, despite some perception of landscape harm, the application should be supported subject to conditions. I will draw also members' attention to an urgent update which suggests a couple of further conditions. One, condition 8, an amendment to a foul sewage treatment condition, that should be implemented prior to occupation, and a further condition regarding the provision of an access to a field to the rear of the site, which is referred to in the report but not immediately secured. I have a number of photos of the existing commercial use, which I will briefly take the committee through. The site itself has a large amount of hard standing for vehicles and has been subject to a complicated planning history, if I can put it like that. Here's a 3D visual showing the houses themselves and the drawings therewith. The playing field I referred to is at the rear of the site, with the 4 houses located towards the front of the site. And there is the site in its context there. It's considered to be a sustainable location on the edge of Bredhurst, but I've mentioned the landscape restrictions earlier, so I'll pause there and answer questions as they crop up. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chapman. Now, as Mr. Chapman has said, there is an urgent update. May I also take declarations of lobbying at this point? I've been lobbied, Councillor Borton, Councillor Hemsley. As everyone, I think, as everyone. Yes. Thank you very much. Right. Mrs. Newman, an objector, please. If you'd like to come forward and press the grey button in the middle, you have 3 minutes. And we'll tell you when you got to near the end.
Good evening, Chairman, members. First of all, I'd like to give you a little picture of where this is sited. Sorry, can you hear it? Is that better? Sorry. The site is located on the edge of Dunn Street, which is a hamlet, and the Oxford Dictionary definition of a hamlet is a small village without a church. Bredhurst is further on down to the east. The hamlet comprises of some 22 residences. The boundary between Bredhurst and Boxley is 100 metres from the Bredhurst Nursery to the east, and along a public footpath KH9 and Manor Farm. At item 821, it refers to the developments recent developments. They are within the village centre itself, one off Forge Lane, which is completely secluded, and the other off running along the side of the motorway to the motorway bridge, which comes in from Capstan and Hempstead. Both these developments are way away from the street and have no street scene at all. The other thing is the access to the rear field, which, according to the way it's worded, is down my driveway. It is not down my driveway. I think it's a mistake in what they said. They say it is along outside the western boundary. What they should say is along inside the western boundary. So I hope that's been rectified. In my opinion, this application does nothing to conserve or enhance the landscape and would irreparably damage the street scene and character of the immediate area. That's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
Right, so we now move to the very busy Councillor Davis, Boxley Parish Council.
Not as busy as you, Mr. Chairman, but thank you. Good evening again. Boxley Parish Council wishes to see the application refused. The site in question lies 650 metres outside the Bredhurst village boundary and is within the Kent Downs AONB, where the statutory purpose of the designation is to conserve and enhance natural beauty. It's felt that the proposed development is contrary to various policies, as the application, if permitted, would expand urban development into the AONB, the North Downs SLA and the Maidstone Medway Strategic Gap. It is considered that the lower half of the site where these new houses are to be built would give an adverse impact, have an adverse impact on the street scene if the development is allowed. The current buildings are single-storey, timber-clad and are of an agricultural design, the site originally being a garden centre. Because previous applications to place more units on the site and to redesignate current units for industrial use have been refused, the site has a low impact on the street scene. The introduction of larger and more prominent structures would change this. It is not unusual for agricultural rural buildings to have areas of hard standing, so the current design is not considered out of keeping in the area. It is felt that the development would not result in a significant improvement and so would contravene policy DM4. Turning to the potential change of use from football pitches at the rear of the site to horse grazing and stabling, as you have heard, there is no independent or dedicated access for horses or horse boxes. The neighbouring stables provide access, but this is a separate business over which the applicant has no control. I've lost myself. In 2004, permission was given by the local planning authority for a change of use from agricultural land to recreational land, specifically for football pitches. The applicant was required to prove there was a need for football pitches locally, and on doing so, permission was granted. The applicant should now be required to provide written evidence from the relevant football association that the need for football pitches has diminished to such an extent that unused ones can be developed. Your attention is also brought to a recent appeal decision concerning a development in Boxley Village. The inspector said, because this site lies within the Kent Downs AONB, where paragraph 115 of the National Planning Policy Framework indicates that development should be restricted, the presumption in favour of sustainable development does not apply in this case, even if there is no 5-year supply of housing land in the district. Having regard to the above, the appeal should be dismissed. Our case rests. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Councillor. Mr. Collins for the applicant.
Thank you, Chairman, members. The first time I was approached in respect of this site. I was obviously fully aware that it is AONB, open countryside, and the other designations that apply. So I went to have a look at the site, and as you will have seen from the many photographs, it's practically covered in buildings and hard surfaces. There's almost no green space on the site. There is no landscaping, no planting, and no real opportunities for ecology. There's also a significant level of activity. As it was said, it's a wedding venue. The licensing for it, there's a very significant number of people who can attend, very large car parking areas. So impact on the AONB comes from buildings, hard surfacing, and significant levels of activity. So at that point, we went away, looked at the volumes, the floor space, all those calculations, and sought to come up with something that does improve the site by having buildings that can be in large open areas that can then be significantly landscaped. Traditional design, but a bit of a modern twist, which I have to say I think is something that Maidstone has embraced very well over the last half a dozen years or so, and has come up with some cracking schemes, including in the AONB, Purple Hill Works, for example, Coldblow Lane, for example, and I'm sure there are many others. Chairman, I think the balance of the case, I think the officers have got it right. There is, of course, harm when you have a development that's in the AONB, but you've got to consider it against the harm that arises at the moment, the impacts and the functional impacts that arise at the moment. And I think when you take into account everything that there is there at the moment and the activity that can occur, this is a positive outcome. On top of all of that, there is the issue of delivery of housing on windfall sites or brownfield sites. The government have been talking about brownfield registers and have just introduced that formally. And I would, in all those circumstances, I think this is a positive thing for the AONB and that it will improve the area. And I will therefore ask you to support it subject to the conditions in the report as well as those that are in the addendum papers. So thank you very much, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Collins. Well, I don't think we've got any ward members for Boxley here, a member of Boxley Parish Council. No, you did make your disclosure at the beginning of the main meeting, just for the record, Councillor Harwood. Right, Councillor Bolton, I think you indicated.
Yes, thank you. Look, I think there is a need for to utilise our brownfield sites personally, particularly up in this part of the borough and across rural parts of the borough. And just going back to a point that was made by the parish council regarding its use as a football pitch, I can remember refereeing 10 years ago. This must be now one of my very first games up there, and never since. And it's not been used since, as far as I'm aware. So there's clearly no demand for that particular use there. Bearing in mind the planning history of the site as well, I really see no way for us to object to this development in principle. It's just about making sure that we get the best scheme possible. The one question I have got, looking at the sort of the plans that we've got up, is on, I think it's the western boundary, but I might have got my north and east muddle, north and south muddle up here. Is there any reason why we don't have more sort of more of a buffer on the western boundary, sort of there? Because it seems like we've just got a little bit of a gap, and I'm just intrigued as to why. Yeah, just there, where the mouse is there. I can't quite work out why that sort of tree line stops. Do we have the opportunity perhaps to beef up a condition to perhaps incorporate a hedgerow or something in there? Just an idea, but in principle, Mr. Chairman, I'd be very happy to move the officer's recommendation as on the paper in front of us.
Councillor Harwood, were you seconding that? Do you wish to speak now, Councillor Harwood?
We've had a long night. I mean, this is a non-conforming site, effectively, and in our parlance we used to use. It's brownfield. It delivers some housing, and if we do get the landscaping right, we can actually remove a lot of hard standing. So hopefully it will be better for the neighbours. But I understand it's got a vexed history. But I think this is a step forward.
Yes, since Councillor Bolton killed off the football on the pitch, doubtless for his controversial refereeing, and all joking aside, I admire Mr. Chapman's understatement. This site has had a long, complicated and controversial planning history. I recall the football pitch use itself was deeply unpopular when it was put forward. In policy terms, it is a borderline issue, but we have to look at the actual facts on the ground. But not just the western boundary, but the northern boundary, I think it is as well, looks a bit scanty in terms of landscaping. So I would say that if this is to happen, it does need to be well enclosed, and because the risk here is that once we accept a site here, that we end up getting it spreading. It's all very well to say, you know, non-conforming use. It looks pretty iffy now. Let's improve it. We need to make sure that it's sufficiently enclosed and robust that we don't end up having the next block developed.
I could come back in detail on a number of points raised by public speakers, but I think, considering the points that members have just raised, I'll focus just on two. One is that landscaping is covered under condition 4 on page 27, and a landscape scheme designed in accordance with the principle of the Council's landscape character guidance needs to be submitted and approved in writing. Now, my advice to you is I consider that gives sufficient control to ensure that the points that have been raised have been covered in regard to landscaping. The other point I just want to mention in regard to access to the playing fields, fields to the rear, is covered by a specific additional condition in the urgent update, and the playing field, my understanding is it does not alter as a consequence of this application, although it is within the red line. The landscaping condition, however, does apply to the whole site and therefore can apply to the edge to the north that was referred to.
Is there any reason, Mr Chapman, before we proceed on this, why the point that Councillor Borton made, and I think Councillor Harwood supported, about the western boundary, and my point about the admittedly shorter northern boundary can't be specifically referenced, because they do seem very scanty on vegetation at the moment?
Would it help members if specific reference was made to the northern and western boundaries within that condition?
In the very last sentence of condition 4, it says the landscape scheme will specifically address the need to provide additional planting on the north and south boundary only. It doesn't mention the west. That's my issue.
Shall I suggest that we add the word west in there as well?
The word west, or alternatively, we could just perhaps rephrase it to address the need to provide additional planting on the site or around the boundary
to provide an appropriate.
I mean, it doesn't matter either way.
I think what Councillor Harwood normally says is to provide an appropriate sense of enclosure.
I'm happy with that. I think we all we know what we're talking about ultimately, so I'm happy with that wording.
Right. I'm just going to take Councillor Spooner, as he'd already indicated before I said I was going to move on.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. I've listened very carefully to the objection. I've listened very carefully to the Parish Council. In an ideal world, it would be nice if this use just went away and reverted to a green field, but that isn't going to happen in the real world. It's a brownfield site. Presumably it has existing use rights. They can be implemented. All sorts of odd uses can happen and can take place there, would be immune from enforcement action. In my view, I think the scheme that's being put forward is a good environmental solution to the problem. And I also think, because of its location in an AONB, there's very little, I would say almost no chance of development creep setting in where other bits of land can be added on. I think this is just a one-off scheme. It will be 4 new houses which will be landscaped and be very much an environmental improvement for the area. And I would certainly support a vote for approval.
Thank you very much, members. I think we're fairly clear what the amended proposal is, and that is also taking on board the urgent update in the report. All those members in favour of approving the application as so amended? I think that's everyone. Right, we now move on to the south of Maidstone, Lewis Court Cottage, Green Lane, Bolton, Monchelsea, Kent, item 10. As previously referred, there is an urgent update and which we'll return to in debate. Can I take any declarations of lobbying? Anyone not been lobbied? Yep, everyone's been lobbied. Right. If you'd like to introduce the report.
Thank you, Chair. This is the proposal to demolish an existing lean-to garage and the erection of 3 detached dwellings with parking and landscaping. I should first of all point out that there has been a recent amendment to the proposal this week, which is detailed in the urgent update, and that is the removal of 1 of the 3 dwellings. So, in effect, the proposal is for the erection of 2 detached dwellings. The proposal is located within Bolton, Monchelsea, and I will take you briefly through some views of the site. It is located within near distance of some 2 listed buildings and associated structures within the curtilage of the listed building, and in effect is a garden of the existing Lewis Court cottage associated with Lewis Court to the north. So those are some views around the site which I can dwell on. But just to draw members' attention to the site itself, then it's highlighted in red on this plan, the listed structures to the north and west, including structures on the northern boundary and western boundary, which curtilage listed. The proposal, as was, included 3 new dwellings highlighted here. The existing Lewis Court cottage highlighted there. The change is the removal of cottage in this location. I'll just go back so you can see. Now you see it, now you don't. And that has been negotiated with the applicants this week, so obviously updated in the urgent update, but not a change which occurred prior to committee last Thursday. We've got some plans and elevations of the dwellings themselves and a couple of streetscapes, albeit with the additional house still in there. Just in terms, turning to the report then, the issues of conservation are highlighted within that report, and members will note the difference of view of the previous and current conservation officers. The current conservation officer has been involved in the most recent changes. Previously has objected to the scheme representing substantial harm to the curtilage listed buildings. As a consequence of the change I've outlined, he has withdrawn that objection. The other issues are outlined in the report. The proposal is considered acceptable in terms of the relevant material considerations and is proposed to be recommended for approval subject to conditions. Thank you.
Yes, if you'd like to come in now, yeah. It's one minor proposed amendment to the conditions on the papers from the legal officer.
On condition 13, will the committee wish to consider when the garage should be constructed and used by?
Very good point. Did you get that? when the garage will be constructed and used by on condition 13. Yeah. If you'd like to think about that and come back to that. Right, thank you very much. Right, we now proceed to Councillor Smith, Bolton-Mon, Chelsea Parish Council. Apologies for keeping you here so late in the evening.
Chairman, members, good evening. At our Parish Council Planning Committee meeting back in January, in considering this application, we came to the same conclusion as your own Heritage Officer, stated in his report of the 2nd of August, where he registered his objection to this application. I'd like to commend Mr Ganther for his professionalism, his honesty, and his clarity in his report. However, I understand that since last week's meeting was adjourned, the applicant has met with his advisors and met with your planning officer and indeed your heritage officer, who has bizarrely now changed his report, so I feel compelled to withdraw my commendation. We have a number of listed buildings in our parish, all of which is very important to us, but this group of 3 listed buildings affected by this application are from the 15th, 17th and 18th century, are in a prominent position on Green Lane in the east approach to our village, and over time have made a very important contribution to the development of our village. What is proposed here will irreparably damage these listed buildings, their character and their setting, and in turn inevitably our village. Your own Heritage Officer's comments and report of the 2nd of August very clearly states the policy position and rightly records his clear and unambiguous objection on heritage grounds. I would reiterate the basis of our objections. Development of this backland in close proximity to these 3 important listed buildings would totally destroy the setting of these buildings and their curtilage buildings. 2, the proposed buildings are a pastiche, a confused collection of architectural devices and styles, precisely what historic England advised against in the setting of a listed building. The sight lines of the access drive to Green Lane are extremely poor and will present a serious safety risk in supporting what was, a week ago, 9 parking spaces, not to mention any service vehicles visiting the proposed properties, which is further exacerbated by the absence of a pavement on the south side of Green Lane. Neighbours of the proposed development have recorded first-hand sightings of badgers on the site and on the adjacent site, and we therefore believe there are shortcomings in the ecology survey and report. The curtilage structures to this listed building are in very close proximity to the proposed dwellings. These structures are afforded protection under undesignated heritage assets. The development of this site would fail to preserve the setting of the listed buildings and the curtilage structures, and would therefore not be in accordance with Section 66 of the Planning and Listed Building and Conservation Act. The harm this development would cause to such heritage assets is substantial in NPPF terms. The public benefits delivered by the proposed scheme, 3 dwellings as it was.
If you could draw your remarks to a close, please.
I will.
Councillor.
Will not in our view come anywhere close to outweighing the level of harm. Reducing the number of dwellings to 2 from 3 does not significantly improve it. Neither does the approach I had from the applicant for a little chat earlier. These important listed buildings have studied this site for hundreds of years. If you were to approve this, you will destroy their setting forever. I implore you to refuse this application. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Mr Blethyn for the applicant, please.
Good evening, members. In view of the discussion to date so far on the urgent update, I really just want to set out the context of this application and some of the background, which I hope will be of assistance. The application followed pre-application discussions with officers on site, and we specifically requested that involved input from the then Conservation Officer, Mike Parkinson. The response received confirmed that in principle 3 units in the locations shown would be acceptable, but there were comments back seeking changes to the design. The designs as submitted are a direct reflection of those discussions, and in due course Mr Parkinson at the time confirmed that they were deemed acceptable. So in good faith the application was submitted back in December. Having waited patiently some eight months for it to be taken to committee, obviously, as members are aware, contrary comments from the current incumbent were received shortly in the lead-up to that committee. The applicant has sought to act proactively in response to those, recognising that does put members and officers in somewhat of a difficult position. And at the first available opportunity, we met with the Conservation Officer, where he very clearly confirmed that his objection related solely to Plot 1. And based on that and those discussions, that same day we agreed to make the amendments. Fully recognising that's happened obviously close to this evening, which in an ideal world wouldn't happen, but the events as they were have led to that. The changes made are a reduction. We've got a clear view now from the Conservation Officer, which is consistent with the previous view, and the Officer's recommendation has remained unchanged. So we do feel that members are able to make a decision on the scheme as it sits here before you tonight. In the event that members feel that's not possible, the application has been formally amended, so my view would be that it's not possible to consider the previous scheme as it stood last Thursday, as it in effect no longer exists. And I would urge members, if that was the view, which I hope it's not, that a more reasonable approach would be to seek a deferral to give more time to consider the changes. Great care has gone into the design, as I said before, following the consultation, and traditional materials are proposed. The applicant is committed to using timber for the weatherboarding, for example, and would be happy to accept a condition in that regard. The design has been carefully considered in respect of avoiding any potential for overlooking or loss of amenity. And the principle of development is clearly supported by both existing and emerging policy, which obviously has undergone recent scrutiny through examination in public. So for those reasons, we would hope that members are able to endorse Officer's recommendation this evening and support the application. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Bleffing. Right, Councillor Mumford. First of all, thank you for spending your wedding anniversary with us this evening.
And thank you for the update at 1 o'clock this afternoon to be told that the applicants and the architect, possibly the officer who predetermined it, had a meeting with the Conservation Officer, which changed everything I was going to say tonight. The first thing is, Mr. Chairman, I will look whether this is constitutionally acceptable, but we can do that at another time. Because this has been thrust upon me at the last moment, I would hope you'd bear with me a little bit. I want to deal with highways, which the Parish Council has brought up, pre-application, and the Conservation Officer's reports. The first thing, highways. You'll see on 5.01, highways comment is no objection, subject to conditions. And at 7.1, the proposal does not raise any overriding parking or highways safety issue. So you would assume that this has been to highways and they've commented on it, wouldn't you? Well, will it surprise you to know it hasn't? It does not fall in their criteria, and they sent a letter back to confirm that and said you could ask for it to be looked at. But that is so misleading, and all the way through this I've been misled. Mr. Wright would confirm what I'm saying. The standard letter was sent that it doesn't conform to the criteria. I'm not going to harp on that. We consider that location important enough that we put speed watch there because it is so dangerous. So tonight, I would ask you if you have any inclination to approve that we defer until we get a highways report because the question's not been answered. Right. As for pre-app, they keep saying pre-app and 2 conservation officers. Pre-app is non-prejudicial. We should not be considering in this room anything that the officers have sat down and said to the applicant. We should consider the application and the evidence in front of us. I got the evidence from the pre-app. Planning is evidence-based. It is a letter from the developers' architects suggesting the design, not the layout, not the impact on the heritage assets, and all Mr. Parkinson said, this design approach seems appropriate. That's what they're basing that on, unless there's other words. So let's forget all this about 2 conservation officers, because pre-app we're not restricted to, and I've got the evidence, the only evidence from pre-app sat there. The officers provided it. So, I've had to change a lot of this. They're saying now, by removing plot 1, that the conservation officer has removed his objection, which was substantial, which was as high as he could go. It wasn't only plot 1 he objected to. Can you please point out for me and the other members the curtilage buildings that the conservation officer was concerned about? That's number 1. That's an old Cobnut barn. And number 2 is there. The officer initially said, this is of listed quality. And now what we've still got that driveway down there. What he initially said in his report, he did say something about plot 1, but he said currently only Lewis Court Cottage sits behind the heritage asset on its own and in a generous garden surrounding. The character will be lost entirely by the infill of the new dwellings. If you look at the officer's report in the update, you will see he still says there is less than substantial harm. So he is saying there's significant harm. And now his report comes right because he directs that at NPPF 34, paragraph 34. As it stood with substantial, we should have been looking at 32 and 33, but we'll go to 34. And we are required here tonight, after being advised by the conservation officers and our planning officer, that the heritage assets are harmed. And under 34, you are now required to do a balance against harming heritage assets, and within the officer's report, I think it's 617, against the provision of new housing, 3 new family homes. So that's what you're balancing. You're balancing heritage harm against 3 family houses. Now 2, but the harm still exists. Right, if I were to tell you that in the last year we have over-delivered from what we expected to deliver by 200 houses. Of the houses we did deliver, 59% were windfall. We have a 6.3 year housing land supply. Now, what you are balancing is damage to the heritage assets, one of them of listed quality, and the curtilage of listed buildings, against 2 family houses. I would also like to ask you to look at the debate, is look at the plans that are in front of you and see how cramped the 2 developments are. There is only one way in that site and only one way out. You've got to turn a car around, and the officer's gone through a point to say this has been proved. If you gave that turning circle to my wife, she'd be in someone's front room. Good evening, Valerie. I believe it to be too cramped. I believe that it still damages, along with the officer, the heritage asset, The balance we are being asked to make under the NPPF, paragraph 34 or 134, is will that be offset by two-family houses? My answer to that is no. Now, with all the changes...
Councillor Mumford, you're going to have to bring your remarks to a conclusion fairly soon. Clark.
I just wanted to make the comment that if you look at the satellite view of this site, it gives you a much different view than the actual image. It really does look like, by no means, a large garden for this listed building, and it's extremely spacious in the plot to the north. And it really does bring home just how incongruous these two houses would be in the back garden of this listed building. And I really do not feel that this is a quality scheme for the location. I'm happy to propose that we refuse this application based on the impact of the listed buildings, its incongruous development, and it's a cramped form of development.
I think you mean on the listed buildings, not of the listed buildings.
Sorry, yes, I did.
Before we proceed any further, first of all, Councillor Mumford, is that what you were saying? So let's not put words in your mouth.
What I'm looking at to propose here, that this, because of the harm to the heritage assets, is contrary to Section 66 of the Planning Act 1990, which is an Act of Parliament. It also is contrary to paragraph 134, I believe, of the NPPF, and also contrary to DM3 of the local plan.
Okay, that's fine as a list of policies, but I think you do need to actually say what the actual harm is, whether it's proximity, whether it's the design, whether it's a combination of the two, etc., etc. Before you do that, I will bring the officer back, and then...
Thank you, Chair. Just briefly, I think the impact that was perceived by the Conservation Officer and is reported in the report, the situation has changed substantially, and he has withdrawn his objection. So, as far as I can see, there is no evidence of any substantial harm of this revised proposal. And I think, frankly, the albeit 11th hour amendments have substantially addressed the concerns that have been raised in a proactive way, and perhaps show a positive, albeit short notice process to improve the scheme substantially. So I think, in a way, the committee could recognise the fact that this, albeit last-minute change, is a substantial improvement to the previous scheme. The issue of highways has not been, highways safety has not been substantially justified. I have a copy of the KCC's response, and there are no concerns. It doesn't come within their consultation protocol. I take the councillor's point, but there's been no evidence submitted that road safety issues are caused by, in effect, an additional 2 units. So I think the officer's report recommends approval, and that was on the basis of 3 units. I consider this to be a substantial improvement to that proposal. Thank you.
I'll come back to that in a minute. Right, I know. Councillor Mumford, yes, you can come back in a moment, but I want to make sure whether there's anyone else who wishes to address this other. Like Councillor Harwood, you have indicated.
Thank you, Chairman. To my mind, the key issue here relates to the impact on the landscape. Because as you head along Green Lane and you're heading towards the, if you like, the village centre, this area is part of the gateway to that. You've got the horse paddocks on the other side of the road. It's a much more rural feel, and then you come into the terrace housing, and then and so on, as you reach Church Street. So, I have some concerns that by introducing modern development with lots of hard standing into what is very soft and informal landscape, you are subtly changing the entrance, and Green Lane is a remarkable survival to have remained green. You know, when we've seen, you know, look at Harwich, look at the amount of development you're getting around places. It is too important a strategic space between South Maidstone and Bourton Monchelsea for us to sacrifice it, albeit that piecemeal. I think a few units here, a few units there will undo the character. So I think there's actually a good landscape argument why the benefit from 2 units will actually cause more harm, you know, to the landscape. Thank you.
The other issue, Councillor Mumford, is whether or not the Parish Council is effectively saying that the harm to the listed building arises because this is essentially a cramped form of development on the site.
Can we put the pictures up again of the curtilage buildings? Can we put the picture of the curtilage buildings up so I can show the committee what we're talking about? Stop. Back. That is the entrance. That to the right is the cob nut, or used to be a barn with cob nuts in it. That is what the officer was concerned about. Every vehicle now will have to go past that building and through that gate. So that gate won't be there. So bring up the next listed building. Go back. Back. That one. Go back. Forward. Or whichever way you're going. Stop. That is the other building that they're talking about. And that is right against the driveway as well. They're the curtilage buildings in that, old farm as it used to be. That is the one he said that it's going to listed value. And you've got the driveway going past those 2 curtilage undesignated heritage assets. So that's where the damage is being caused. If you go back to the plan, one of them is looking right at one of those curtilage buildings. That driveway is where I've just taken you down. Those buildings, one is to the right as you come in, and the other one is to the left as you pass Lewis Court Cottage. That is the damage, or the major damage. Also, like the Conservation Officer says, it damages the setting of Lewis Court House, the main house, with its large garden, which has already been cut off. So that's the damage that we're looking at. You put that into words.
I was trying to. But, right, I think we need to conclude this. Are you taking on board any of the comments on landscaping that Councillor Harwood?
Yes, we'll take those on board because that is the entrance to our village. And it's the Kirtledge, damage to the Kirtledge buildings and also the setting of the listed buildings, which is contrary to the policies I said earlier.
What you're saying is that having weighed the advantage or the positive gain, if you put it like that, of the housing units against the less than substantial harm done to the heritage assets, the conclusion is that the development, by nature of its proximity to the curtilage of the non-designated heritage assets and the setting of the listed building, outweighs the public benefits, essentially. Now, and the landscaping issue, Councillor Harwood, do you wish to add anything on that or not?
I think the critical point here is that because of the cramped nature of development and the hard standing, it detracts from not just the listed buildings but also from the landscape on this green and spacious approach to the village. And because I think we need to really underline the characteristics of Green Lane, where there is a very clear break between the village centre and the countryside beyond. And this is right on that boundary. And therefore, if we change the nature of the spacious development of the older units here, we then take away from the overall benefit. So I think that's the way we need to talk about it.
Could you try and put that in a sentence, please?
Just say that by virtue of the cramped nature of the proposed development and the extent of hard surfacing within a previously green and landscaped area, it will detract from the local character on this gateway to the village centre from the surrounding countryside, something like that. It's you're moving from the countryside into the village centre. It is the spacious layout of these older houses which
I think no need to go through it again. I think that's clear. That would be a separate ground, Mr. Chapman.
I would like to come back before a decision is made on 2 points. First of all, considering the last-minute nature of the change that we've all discussed in a little bit of detail, I'd suggest if members are concerned about the impact on listed buildings, and quite frankly, my advice to you is there is no substantial impact from the revised proposal on listed buildings, I would suggest that members consider deferring the application in order to allow the Conservation Officer to provide a more detailed response dealing with the points that have been raised. And on the second point about the impact on the character and appearance of the area, I point out that the site is, apart from the access, completely landlocked and not visible from any public location, and that under policy DM10 in the submitted local plan is, in my opinion, acceptable as a development within residential garden land.
Any comment on that, Councillor Harwood? And also the point that, that the site, the built development of the site is very close to the boundaries of the site, so that could be an issue in terms of how the site appears.
Well, I think that clearly you're removing hazel trees and so on, and you're putting two-storey buildings in their place. Of course, there will be a landscape impact. You have to look across the garden, but it's not that wide, the garden.
Okay, you're maintaining that position. Right, I'm only entertaining at this point comments about the motion that's been put forward. Is it on that, Councillor?
I also wanted to mention the fact that the easternmost development is so close to the boundary that there isn't even the ability to do good structural landscaping along that boundary. So I think that's also something as part of the design on that scheme.
That was essentially what I was talking about in terms of the closeness to the boundary. But thank you for making that slightly clearer than I did. Right. Anyone else wish to add to that? No. We have a 2-point recommendation. But did you want to say anything, James? Just. I don't think deferral.
I think members have got two clear grounds. I mean, obviously, in terms of just making sure that we, on the refusal, I can see where this is going. Members have got the correct policies they're referring to. I mean, obviously, in terms of DM10 that Mr. Chapman referred to, it does say that the higher density resulting from the development would not result in significant harm to the character and appearance of the area. If members are turning around and saying there is a spaciousness to the garden areas, that's informed by that character, and that is lost by the result of these developments coming forward, and also the consequent proximity to the boundary. So I think that's already been encapsulated in the grounds that you've already included. What I would like to do is just hear, I think, Mr. Chapman encapsulate those, so we're very clear on a ground of refusal going forward.
Mr. Chapman, I think that would be a very good idea.
Yeah. So my understanding is that members wish me to articulate a wording regarding interpretation DM10, residential garden ban policy, as a reason for refusal. Is that correct?
Right. Ground one. Yes, I think that would be a good idea. 5-minute adjournment, members.